Hello and welcome to Cryptocast. I'm Ray Doherty. Thanks for joining me for episode 6, Tales from the Past, Bunyip Special, where we investigate the strange and unusual stories from yesteryear's newspapers. Now listen, it's time for us to get serious on the issue of bunyips. Are they real? Were they real? Do they still exist? We don't know. But what we do have is some interesting bunyip articles today, thanks to the National Library of Australia and its digital service, trove.nla.gov.au. As always, I try to present an interesting show for you to listen to and enjoy. And if you think so, please give this podcast a like and please consider subscribing to the channel wherever you get your podcasts so that you can keep up to date with all of our podcasts as they become available. Because believe me, we have a lot of fascinating interviews and stories still to come in the weeks and months ahead. So stick around and hit that like button. Now, let's travel back in time. First stop, 1868. Today's first story I am calling the Logan Bunyip. And that's Logan in Queensland near Brisbane, where back in the day there was nothing but deep, wild, rugged bushland filled with fresh-running creeks, streams, swamps and rivers, such as the Logan River, which is a major waterway, and today Logan is home to over 320,000 people and sits between Brisbane and Beenleigh on the way to the Gold Coast if you've ever been to the area. But this story is from the Queenslander, which was published between 1866 and 1939. This story was published on Saturday the 12th of December, 1868. On page 11, called The Bunyip, written by Alex Warder. Boom Bar, November 4. I would imagine that's when the story was submitted. Sir, the bunyip is a frequent source of conversation at bush firesides, some believing in the existence of such an animal or fish, others strenuously disbelieve it has any existence beyond the imaginations of bush fogies. The latter parties usually fall to ridiculing the notions of believers in the bunyip, and thus bad blood is engendered on the subject, which I hope your pages will yet to clear up. On this station there is a young fellow from Logan district. He is fairly read and intelligent man, as he firmly believes that the bunyip exists in the lagoons of his district. I am not acquainted with the locality myself, but it appears that an extensive chains of deep water holes exist there, and that these water holes are inhabited by the bunyip, which according to his impression is something of a seal tribe, perhaps a freshwater seal. It appears to be very shy, and it has an acute hearing, so that on the occurrence of the slightest noise, it plunges into the water, and that the noise of these plunges is frequently heard by parties passing along the roads near the lagoons. More than one person has got sight of the bunyip, or its head rather, and a fearful-looking object it must be described to me as it rises slowly and cautiously above the water. The apparition is only for an instant, as should a human eye gaze upon it, it disappears as mysteriously as it came. Such are the descriptions given here of the bunyip, have been repeated by men that come from the Dinner Corner, near the foot of the main range where the great lagoons exist, from men acquainted with the Upper Mary, Fitzroy, Condamine, Laidley and other rivers. There being so little variation regarding the bunyip in account of these men, it is not reasonable to suppose that there is truth after all in what not only a few scoff at, jeer at. The local indigenous people to a man believe in the bunyip and look horrified when it is mentioned. I trust some of your readers will be able to enlighten us to this subject. Well, that's an interesting one to start off with. So a young guy working on a station somewhere in Queensland tells the story of where he's from in Logan, that there is a bunyip. Based on descriptions, it looks like a seal. Now, this is not the first time we've heard that, is it? We heard the stories of down in Denny in New South Wales of what looks like a freshwater seal. I mean, it's incredible to think that they could go that far. I don't even know if they could. I'm not a seal expert. But this is pretty fascinating, don't you think? I mean, what do you think? Put your comments down below on the Logan Bunyip. Tell me what you think about it. I mean, I have no idea where the locality of these places could be, but it would be worth going through the historical villages and probably having a look. I mean, I think, we're hearing stories. I mean, this fellow, who's the writer, is hearing stories told by multiple sources, multiple different people in multiple river systems throughout Queensland, and they're all describing the same thing, and that they seemed, in his opinion, to be telling the truth. It's not a bad one to start off with, first of all, is it? Our next story comes from the Portland Guardian and the Normanby General Advertiser in Victoria from Monday, March 13th, 1871. I'm calling this the Corio Bay Bunyip. I hope I pronounced that right, Corio Bay. Now, Corio Bay is in Geelong, Victoria, and is home today to over 15,000 people. I hope I said that right, Corio Bay Bunyip. If I haven't, please let me know. But I'm doing the best we can with the pronunciations of some of these locations that I've never been to. This is on page 2, Portland Guardian and Normanby General Advertiser, Monday, March 13, 1871. In the evenings, the bunyip. An amphibious animal was captured near the shores of Corio Bay on Thursday last by some men who are engaged in obtaining bail net for ships along the eastern beach. Their attention, according to the Express, was drawn to the little creature which was in the water and making for the beach. The men succeeded in capturing the little stranger, and upon examining it, they were puzzled to know what position it occupied in natural history. The description given by the men is that it was about 1.25 feet in length from tip of the nose to the end of the tail. The head of the animal was rather flat, and its tail was about the thickness of a second finger. The appearance of the animal at first sight resembled a ferret. Its forelegs were somewhat shorter than its hind ones, and it was web-footed. Its coat was glassy fur and was not dissimilar to that of a beaver, and several gentlemen who saw it classed the stranger as a species of beaver. The nose is something like a ferret or a rat's, and its front teeth overlap each other and protrude like a rabbit's. The creature is supposed to take shelter at night on land, and when it was captured, it was making for a nest in the cliff, just abutting on the water high tide mark. In its nest were found a number of stockings, seaweed, and sticks closely stuck together in the form of a beaver's house, and amongst other things found inside the home was a leather purse, which is presumed to have been dropped on the beach and taken charge of by the unknown quadruped. Unfortunately, the unknown creature was not preserved, as the men threw it aside, not thinking of what interest it may be to the naturalist. Is this the bunyip at last? Well, I say no, because it sounds to me like they're describing a baby seal, maybe, because seals, in and around Victoria. I don't know if there's any in Geelong, but it's certainly very, very interesting. I mean, what was it? 1.25 feet long, glassy fur. Maybe it did sound like a beaver, but unfortunately they didn't mention the big flat tail of a beaver. What sort of creature is this? Anyone got any ideas? Let me know in the comments, or send me an email. Let me know in the comments that on the Corio Bay Bunyip. I don't think this was a bunyip. I think it was a complete misidentification myself, but it's still very interesting because they're describing an animal that probably we've never heard of. But it sounds like a little baby seal, but who knows? I'm not sure. Now, our last story today had to be heavily edited for several reasons. One was mainly the length of the story. It was a full of completely irrelevant discourse that was sent in the paper by a reader. So it was a letters to the editor submission in 1919. The sender tells us how this story occurred 50 years earlier from his recount. So obviously he was there at the time, which puts it around 1869. The second reason it had to be heavily edited is that it used a great deal of language that is so simply unacceptable by today's standards. And I won't read hateful, nasty, and just plain careless comments that are intertwined with a really interesting story. The third reason is because the translation of the article from the original print into text was very badly, translated. It was very badly copied, so it was very hard to get a lot of particular sections of it out, flesh it out properly. But however, as I said, there was a lot of irrelevant, just absolute babble in this to get to the heart of the story. But it is still very interesting and very, very funny. It's got a great twist to it on the end, so we'll get to it in a second. Now, this story apparently occurred in Caboolture in 1869. For those of you who don't know the area, oddly, it's local to me, only 20 minutes from my house, situated in the southern region of the Sunshine Coast and part of the Moreton Bay Regional Council area. It's very close to Bribie Island, and today the area of Caboolture has over 100,000 people. So let's get into this crazy story that's been retold by a witness in 1919, and it was published in the Northern Herald from Cairns on Wednesday, 26th of November, 1919, page 32. I call it the Caboolture Bunyip. So let's get into it. For the Post and the Herald. It happened just about half a century back when our capital of Brisbane and our government was just then babbling infants. But the leanings towards democracy or socialism or some other demented ideas were just about as strong as shoe leather. As I have said, some of our early politicians suffered with swelled heads, and in consequence our rising colony also had to suffer there for their ideas. Politicians held the idea that station owners and others were not competent enough to breed an animal that was respectable enough to carry John Hop, which means copper or police officer. So they collared a large piece of land on the outskirts of Brisbane, had it securely fenced, and then called it a reserve that was to be used as a stud farm for the sole purpose of breeding horses for police service. So far, so good. The next move was to import a suitable stallion from the old dart, which, of course, was duly carried out. They called the import Shales, and he, the horse, had a reputation for having done his 18 miles in an hour's trotting march, which was also very good. And if I remember right, the Marvel drew his last gasp at the ripe old age of 27 at Tabragulba Station, that was owned then by de Burgh Percy, Deburghpersse. I have come to write onto the mark of which is connected with this police stud farm. That was the home of the old Shales, the imported stallion. The boundary fence of the stud farm, or police paddock as it was more generally called, was for some distance parallel with the main Caboolture and Gympie Road. The place was almost virgin bush, for houses were like angel visits, few and far between. It was an ordinary looking piece of land, but yet had a history that bordered on romantic, for inside the fence was a reed-like swamp or morass that was held in superstitious fear by the original inhabitants, who were fairly numerous then, but I suppose at this present time it would be a hard matter finding a living relic of that vanished race. Just stop there on a side note, the writer is wrong. The area was home to the Gubby Gubby people, who lived traditionally all the way down to the Pine River, to where today the Pine River Bridge is, but the Pine River, late into the 1920s, and still live in the region on that Sunshine Coast area today. Back to the story. It is a strange trait that amongst almost all the Aboriginal tribes that there is some spot they have strictly tabooed for reasons that belong to the past, and I dare say would make very interesting reading if the facts could ever be brought to light. The morass or swamp, according to the local Indigenous people, was the home to the devil, and none of them could be induced to go near it at any price. Superstitious fear was not without its virtues, for without doubt it was a fever-infested spot, and woe betide the traveller who pitched his camp within easy reach of the swamp, for the skeeters were there in countless numbers, and naturally their game would be to make things fairly lively through the long and silent hours of the night. But this Bunyip, well, it was a medico who first set the ball rolling by asserting that he had seen an almost indescribable animal rush across the road and simply walk over the newly built 3-rail fence. There was no jumping about it, for the animal simply walked over it. This was his tale and the description of the animal. Well, he could not rightly explain, for the first time was just at the close of day when objects are not easily discerned. But as far as he could judge, the animal was very tall and had a head like a pig, with one horn in the centre, a long neck with a shaggy mane and a razor-like back, and a long sweeping body with a bushy lion's tail attached to it. That was as far as he could go, except to state that the cursed thing bore no resemblance to either horse or a cattle species. Naturally, some of the Gutu goodies hinted at the double sight, but the suspicion led to upset when it was clearly proved that the medico was a respectable member of the IOGSV Society. Now, I have no idea what the IOGSV Society is, but obviously back then it was a fairly important organisation, whichever it was. It was only hours after the sensation at night that others came forward to say they saw the curbed thing. However, it was strange that none of them could properly describe it. Not long after the story, the circulation of the paper rose by leaps and bounds, for the editor's virile pen gave the show a free scope, and it was of great public interest for all to bear and read about this strange animal that was called a bunyip. Public opinion got a bit mixed, for some that decided that then the government had imported the confounded thing for experimental purposes to breed a superior sort of racehorse for police duty. The news was spread both far and wide that highly respected private persons had seen the thing and narrowly avoided it. The government rose to the occasion and declared that part of the country is unsafe or sacred Indigenous land, owing to the preambulations of the unknown animal. It was a glorious sight to see a posse of police fully armed on a 4-day search for the strange and dreadful thing, and how we can still recall those strapping fellows of past days. The police did their best, but to no avail. The government discharged the police, deciding to engage the services of an expert bunyip trapper. The right man was found after some difficulty, as the gentleman in question had some previous practical experience of those animals in other lands. The general public felt much more relieved. The expert hailed from the wild and savage lands of what is known as Russia, and he had a reputation of being able to digest any sort of food or substance, including candles, wicks included, and any other sort of tack that contained plenty of blubber and fat. We youngsters were naturally a bit timid of the bunyip, but the talks we were told about the expert almost scared us to death. Well, time went on as usual, and the expert must have been having a strenuous time of it, for his reports were received day by day, and although he never had the luck to run against the animal, there were others who could swear they had seen it prowling in other parts on several occasions. It was reported to have been seen in different parts at the same hour and date by people who were respected for their truth. Anyway, the expert had no success, and as our colony was young, many of the new arrivals began to imagine that they had made a mistake coming to such a infested bunyip land. When things began to once again look dark and hopeless, a ray of sunshine came by way of a report from the expert trapper, for he had, just at the close of day, caught a glimpse of this formidable animal. It was as he expressed it, a moment's glance, and then it disappeared, and therefore he could not accurately describe it, but he was happy and gave the public full strength of how he would trap and overcome the brute. It was just at this particular time opposition members made things a bit lively in Parliament by asserting that the country had gone to the dogs, and that the sheet of the charge home by alluding to many of the state government's investments were branded as failures, and of course the heavy expenses that were incurred trying to trap the famous bunyip received its full strength from their lungs. And no doubt it took effect, for shortly afterward the expert reported that he had safely landed the animal after a fierce and terrible struggle, and once again the general public felt greatly relieved. It was really wonderful, for the dreadful bunyip had been captured at last and would be exhibited at an early date for the benefit of the public. A price of admission was fixed. When a mate arrived in Brisbane, including his wife, kids, trooped en masse to view this wonderful beast. But oh Lord, the surprise and takedown was as big a suck-in as there was. And then the social occasion that was supposed to be legislated for the people, and who entered in one door with many smiles, but came out by another door with much profanity, as it was no wonder, for they had lost valuable time and parted up with good coin to gaze upon an unfortunate half-grown pig. For that was the animal the expert had trapped, and he would take his solemn oath that it was the only one had been running in that large police paddock or stud farm. There was only one alternative for the suffering public, and that was to take the hose that they had received it, and so ended the episode of the famous bunyip. On a side note, shortly afterwards the government resigned, and the cause was principally owing to the lack of funds, as expenses had been very heavy in trapping the so-called bunyip that had turned out to be a harmless little pig. The bunyip also became a back number, excepting for the belief of the local indigenous people, who still held a place in superstitious fear for the creature. Wow, what do you think of that? That was pretty amazing. I mean, I never even knew stories like this existed in southeast Queensland. I mean, we hear them so oftentimes in Victoria, New South Wales, or South Australia, but to hear these stories close to where you live, it's fascinating. That the bunyip was never found. The local indigenous people kept holding it in high regard, and that it was real, and there was never any follow-up article because people just simply weren't interested. So obviously, but the whole episode was so heavily dragged out and cost so much at the time that people were just over it, and they didn't want to know. Did the bunyip continue to live in the area? Well, local indigenous people say it did, according to the writer. Still held in regard. And in fact, in terms of Yowie research, that's not that far from plethora of sightings dating back all the way in the old days, even till today. It's an amazing story to think that these creatures exist. What was the bunyip? Why aren't we seeing any reports of it today? I mean, we're hearing of things that people are claiming to be bunyips in terms of, shimmermans or yowies that are invisible, but a sea creature that lives in the creeks and the rivers and the oceans looks like something that's completely indescribable. Creature that he described, with the exception of the horn and the tail, sounded to me like a yowie, and the region was full of them. And in some parts, not far away from that area, Caboolture, still is today. Sightings about plenty. Were they describing a yowie? Maybe was it someone having a go at people, hoaxing them? The local indigenous people didn't think so, and a doctor who's obviously part of some important organisation. See, he didn't think so either, but you've got to remember, you really have to remember that in those days, people of certain professions, doctors, solicitors, lawyers, police, were all above reproach. Their word was taken as gospel. Of course, today, we know different. But back then, their word was as good as God's. Been a fascinating look today into these 3 stories of bunyips, 2 in Queensland, 1 in Victoria. We've got some great new episodes coming up in the next few weeks, so stick around. And thank you for listening to Cryptocast. I'm Ray Doherty.